Hello and welcome to Nature Connects, TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from the Northeast and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tricia Yathley, Offshore Wind Policy Manager for the Nature Conservancy. I coordinate TNC's offshore wind work to ensure that it can be used to meet our climate, conservation, and community goals. After spending most of our time together talking about offshore wind in the context of climate and conservation goals, in this final webinar in our offshore wind series, we will be talking about our community goals. An all-in energy strategy designed to respond to a national energy emergency means that energy and transmission infrastructure will touch down in communities across the country. These past 15 years or so, we have collectively been asking, how will offshore wind projects impact and benefit coastal communities and ocean users? How much say do communities have in the designing and ultimately managing the social value they get from offshore wind projects? During today's webinar, we're going to address these questions. We're going to talk about why offshore wind companies around the world use community benefits agreements and other approaches to deliver value to communities like job skills, housing, wealth building. And we're going to look to hear about the role for locally led consultation and decision-making in these processes. On January 15th of this year, the Oceanic Network released an offshore wind jobs report. The report lists out the rapid growth of the industry in the United States and how that growth has resulted in 1,900 supplier contracts across 40 states, $40 billion in investments since 2010, and $25 billion in new supply chain investments, $4 billion in steel production, and almost $2 billion in new shipbuilding, $277 million in workforce development, and the support for 300,000 jobs, including 2,000 manufacturing and construction jobs for the South Fork Wind Project alone. But to put all of these numbers in the context of community benefits and sharing the social value of offshore wind with the communities that share the ocean waters with these projects, we have to understand who gets access to the supplier contracts and why, who can access the jobs created by this level of investment, what information and skills do they need to access these opportunities. We should be asking these same questions with the build-out of any large-scale energy project. Because despite community engagement being a long-standing integral aspect of offshore wind development, there still is no universally shared definition or consensus about what qualifies as good practice or a people-positive renewable energy project. A number of organizations, including TNC, have worked to develop best practices to improve understanding about how effective and meaningful interactions between communities and the developers of utility-scale renewable energy projects can benefit both parties. In March of 2024, TNC developed a white paper in partnership with the University of Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership and with input from major offshore renewable energy companies, including one of our speakers today, Lindsay Dougan, that acts as a concise guide on the rationale for community engagement and good practice guidelines. It's my pleasure to introduce you now to our guest speakers. Our first presenter today is Mark James. Mark is the interim director of the Institute for Energy and Environment at Vermont Law and Graduate School, where he also serves as an associate professor of law. His research focuses on how to integrate inclusive, democratic processes into the clean energy transition. Recent publications, including integrating non-price criteria into offshore wind solicitations, which was research supported by TNC, increasing public interest group participation in regional transmission processes, and funding just transitions for coal communities. Today, Mark is going to share some of the findings from the Institute's research this past year on how community benefit agreements have been negotiated in the United States as compared to other countries, and some recommendations for best definitions and best practices. Our second presenter, Lindsay Dougan, is a senior community investment manager with SSE Renewables. SSE Renewables is one of the largest renewable developers and operators in Europe and Asia. Lindsay is an international expert on renewable community benefit and social value. Lindsay will share her experience of supporting over $419 million in community benefits agreements across Europe and Japan. Prior to her decade in the renewable sector, Lindsay had senior management roles in charities and social enterprises in the UK. As you think of questions for Mark and Lindsay, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please indicate whether the question is general or for a specific presenter. We will hear both presentations first before the Q&A portion of today's program. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And Mark, I will pass it on to you to get us started.
So we have been looking at community benefit agreements and offshore wind development and thinking about how to systematically integrate them into the development process, knowing that there's kind of a patchwork right now and not really a common set of rules for how they would be integrated into the development process, nor even a common set of practices for how they might be discussed between and sort of developed, which is a different line of research. So that's sort of the basis where we're starting off thinking about how the use of these non-economic factors can be potentially integrated in community benefit agreements. There we go. This is just a little bit of information. You can contact me. Please, if you do have any questions, you can reach out at any time. So we'll start with some key terms and what's in an acronym, because we do see these put out. We see, your community benefit agreements, but there are host community agreements. There are tribal benefits agreements. There are good neighbor agreements, and there are examples of all of these happening sometimes within the same state, but definitely across all of the states which have ongoing offshore wind development. And it really is the common part here is that there is an agreement, and that is a binding legal agreement signed between parties. And really it's who is the party who is signing that agreement. We have our community benefits agreement, you have a community benefits organization, a host community, which is a local government, a tribal benefit, you have tribal council, good neighbor agreement, so a little more expansive than that. That's what's been signed on with groups in Nantucket, neighbors, community groups, local businesses sort of coming together and integrating that. There's not clarity all the time in what terms should be used at what time. So you will see a host community agreement might include or integrate in a community benefit organization. But because there is an enforceability issue that having it signed between the developer and the local government creates a mechanism and parties who are capable of enforcing the agreement. So just be aware of always to sort of look behind the term to see who are the parties that are involved in the agreement itself. And the goal here is to drive energy justice, this achieving equity in our energy transition, trying to remediate existing harms, and also to have reparations for past damages. And there are procedural, distributive, restorative, and recognition elements within the energy justice theory. So thinking about engagement from the community, how benefits are distributed, how those benefits or allocation of benefits are geared towards providing, ameliorating past harms. Very important to ensure that that is in place if we're going to have this goal of achieving equity. And the other terms that we're then coming back to is thinking about who is the community and what are the benefits. And that changes between different agreements, even when they have the same term. You have to think about who is the community that has been impacted, who are the parties that will represent that community, and again, what are the benefits that are going to be received. It could range from payments in lieu of taxes to investments in workforce development, investments in local infrastructure, or even turning over an investment fund to allow the community to decide how to allocate those benefits and who might apply for them. So thinking about the community, thinking about the benefits, we know that it's a legally binding agreement, but there's considerable flexibility in who the community is and what benefits are being distributed within that community. So in our research, sort of identified 3 different areas where there are opportunities for community benefit agreements, and we've actually seen community benefit agreements emerge out of these, sort of thinking chronologically, starting from the wind energy area lease auction, which is conducted by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Then you have state offshore wind solicitations, where the state or itself is procuring energy or energy products, to the actual physical siting of the infrastructure necessary to bring that wind energy on shore. And then within each of those, are they voluntary or are they mandatory? Because there is some variation between different processes, even within the same organization, how it changes over time. So I'm going to go through each of these and talk a little bit more in detail about what we have found. So we'll start with the first process, which is the lease auction itself, which is creating allocating the ocean space where the wind farm will be constructed. And BOEM, as we've talked about in our prior report, we were focused on these non-economic criteria, and the BOEM runs a multi-factor auction. So it's not always what's the lowest price. They're allowed to include non-monetary factors as bidding credits, and that's a regular practice that they have. And there are a couple of examples where community benefit agreements were included as a bidding credit. So a bidder is able to submit and say, I have met this requirement. Sometimes it's a community benefit agreement. It could be a workforce development, something for the fishing community. So in the first one being in 2015 in Massachusetts, where there was a 10% bidding credit, that's led to the Vineyard Power Cooperative Community Benefit Agreement, 10% bidding credit. Interestingly, in 2018 lease auction that was conducted, it was proposed to have a bidding credit in the proposed sale notice. It was subsequently removed when they did the final sale notice. Came back up again in 2022 in California in the Humboldt and Morro Bay lease auctions, where there were 5% bidding credits. Now, these are, if you notice, this is the language difference here. 2015 for an executed CBA, 2022 for a commitment to enter into a CBA. So a change in when that CBA has to be executed, creating some additional flexibility for California, for the bidders in the California lease auction. Second part, state solicitation. So states are using these non-economic, non-monetary factors in soliciting offshore wind energy and environmental attributes, commonly seeing labor, workforce development, minority, women-owned business development, supply chain. These are common places where we are seeing the use of these factors. Our state survey, looking at Massachusetts, these different states, we see that when I wanted to point out a couple of places in Massachusetts, in its forced solicitation, used economic development criteria points could be given to projects that demonstrate benefits from a community benefit agreement or workforce agreements. So that was an option. It was not a mandatory obligation, but an option that a bidder could submit an intention to use one of these tools. And therefore it was 15 points out of a total 100. There were a number of different parts. So not a mandatory obligation, but an option to do that too. Again, most states are not explicitly including community benefit agreements. There is some flexibility in the language. You have examples of states using community benefit agreements when there's not really a community identified. For example, what Maryland did, just titling it that, even though it really is focused on a workforce development agreement. And lastly, the state permitting and siting, where these facilities are coming online and they need to site substations, transmission lines. They have to go through and get approval from that. Whether it's through the Public Utility Commission, they're going to have a certificate of public good or certificate of public convenience and necessity issued to that facility to allow it to be constructed. This is the utilities who are seeking to do this. And there are specific bodies who will evaluate that. Listed here are some of the bodies that are doing that or have some oversight over that. And we see through that process, you often the utility or parties, the developers who are negotiating host community agreements to demonstrate the benefits that they're bringing. Here in Massachusetts and Barnstable, there are 2 host community agreements that have been signed for, and examples up and down the coast in Rhode Island and New York as well. So that's probably the most active place where we're seeing host community agreements and the distribution of benefits. I just wanted to point out an example here where we actually have an opportunity. New York, in passing its Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefits Act, created this option for a streamlined permitting process. If you want to get into that process, you need to provide benefits to host communities, sort of incentivizing them, sort of captured by the project size itself. So it's a payment size. It's set out as a minimum for a megawatt annual fee divided up amongst residential electric utility clusters. Doesn't preclude the use of separate host community agreements, nor does it override anything that might be put in place there. So you are seeing other agreements that are coming up through that. States are, even when states are not consistently using them, they are consistently, for offshore wind, they are using them in other places. And this is just examples here for infrastructure projects. They're common. Maine uses them for onshore wind. Maryland requires it for an expanded of their dredge to fill facility from the Baltimore Harbor. Connecticut has it for renewable energy projects greater than 5 megawatts, but exempts offshore wind. So there are states are comfortable using these, but we've not seen a full integration into the offshore wind solicitation process. And then the last part, which I think so Lindsay will be able to talk more about her experience, some common elements in good practice, transparency. One of the obstacles is knowing what other organizations are doing or what other communities have received. Having a strong governance system so that communities have a say in both the negotiation of the agreement and its implementation. Compensation, ensuring that this flows from the transparency, but ensuring that communities understand what they could be receiving in return for their agreement to host critical infrastructure, and flexibility in the agreement that allows for changes as conditions change, and perhaps the change in how benefits are being allocated and or distributed. So a lot going on in this area, but not a lot that has been standardized, and there's still efforts and growth to happen to make sure that communities are truly able to participate in this energy transition. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Lindsay to tell about her experiences.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Really helpful to walk through the acronyms. There's so many of them. And we'll turn it over to Lindsay now, who is going to talk with us about how SSE Renewables has approached this type of engagement and why it's important to them.
Thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon in the United States. I hope you can all understand my strong Scottish accent okay, but I'm delighted to share some of our experience that we've had within Europe and Asia of delivering community benefits. So my name is Lindsay Dougan. I've put my contact details here if anybody would like to follow up with any questions or any information after the session. But just to give you a little bit of information, so I work for SSE and primarily our renewables business. We are one of the largest developers and operators of renewable energy within Europe and have expanded to provide provision in Asia as well. And as a company, it's part of our founding ethos that and our mission statement that we provide value for both our shareholders, but also more importantly for the wider society. And through that, we have led the way of the renewable industry within Europe of committing to reinvest parts of our profits back into the local communities who host our renewable assets, part of our ethos around that is that we recognise that many of the components of the renewable energy industry are not owned by any individual person. You know, nobody owns the wind, and so it is important that we share that value with our local communities, and that we also learn from our past industries and our forefather industries, and recognise the importance of having a just transition and of sharing the value with local people. So to date, our current portfolio invests over £330 million, which is around about $419 million that will be reinvested into the local communities. And through that, we work with over 150 communities. Now, every community is unique. They have their own experience, their own issues, their own opportunities, but there is some consistency that can be achieved, and there is learning that we can provide from each community to help the future communities that are accessing renewables. Some of our learning, and now we have been sharing benefits with communities for over 20 years. And so we have a long history, and we have learned from that experience that we can share with other countries that are more in the infancy of the process. So one thing that we think is very important is we do have a policy as a company. Now that is setting out how we will invest in communities, and similarly to what Mark so eloquently put, it is so important that there is the strong governance around how developers manage and operate any investment they're making into communities, and so our policy sets the scene for that. Now it is slightly different, and we, for those that know the complexity of the UK, we do have a number of different governments, and we also support the Republic of Ireland government. So each government has their own guidance as to how developers should provide and operate. In Scotland, for example, it is voluntary to provide any and share any value with local communities. In the Republic of Ireland, for any future sites that are under their renewable energy scheme, there is a mandation that there is community benefit provided. It is also different from potentially what you have in some of the American provision, in that community benefit is kept separate from any consenting and bidding process here. But what we have learned with the community benefit is there's a number of key principles. One, we think it is vital that these funds are locally led. We as developers are not the experts, and we have to take our responsibility and work closely with the community members and the community stakeholders. We achieve that by doing quite comprehensive consultation, and we also ensure that it is local people that lead the decision making and decide how each of the funding in their area should be allocated. We also think that it should focus on the areas that host that renewable asset. Now, some of our funding that might be at a regional level, but also right down into a local community. And every community, what they prioritise, what their strategic priorities are different, but we do find that there is some consistencies across communities. For example, both in Japan and Ireland and the UK, there's a big focus on skills provision. How can we maximise the opportunities for local young people living near the renewable assets? Housing is a big priority, particularly in coastal communities in Japan, but also in the Scotland. A lot of our renewable assets are in the north of Scotland, which is facing a depopulation concern. So having strong housing that people can access is important. And another priority that we think is very a key focus and a key responsibility of the renewable sector is to be able to demonstrate the impact that these funds have. Now that is important both for the local community that's hosting the asset, so that they can share and they can get the benefit of understanding the difference that the funding have had for their area, but also for that responsibility to share the learning with others. So we've just done a recent consultation from our decade of providing regional funding in Scotland, and that's shown that 96% of the projects we funded are still in operation and still providing value for communities. And we've also found that we get about an 11% return on the social value that is created through our investment. And that is through wider things in terms of community members' satisfaction, savings to our health service, saving to a lot of our statutory responsibilities in that area. I thought it would be useful if I talked you through an example from two of our offshore wind farms. So the first is actually the world's largest offshore wind farm that's being built, and it's being built across off the northeast of England coast. Now, many of you might not be familiar with the UK. The northeast of England is an area that has many of our key football, or what or you would call soccer teams within it. It's a thriving area of the UK, but it is an area that has been was heavily involved in our oil and gas industries and has had significant decline in recent generations. So it has become a key focus within the UK of being one of our key centre points for the green skills revolution, and ensuring that we invest in a strong locally based supply chain. So it's a real hub for green energy within the UK. And so when we came to build the Doggerbank wind farm, we did a consultation with local people to identify what were the priorities, and they had identified that skills and jobs and enhancing education was important to them. Now, as a developer, we thought that that focus would be on when people were leaving school and ensuring that they could access jobs. But actually, when we did the in-depth consultation and spoke to the education and skills stakeholders, what they guided us to is actually the investment needed to focus on young people between the ages of around 7 to 12. And the reasons for this was that we needed to reinvigorate those young people. They potentially came from families where there was multi-generational unemployment, or there was no known people within their families that accessed STEM jobs. So we needed to engage with them earlier and then help the education system to enhance the STEM provision, to encourage them to retain the STEM focus in their future education, so that they gain the skills and the abilities to access the STEM jobs that were becoming available within their wider sector. And through that, we worked with the local education boards, the local skills stakeholders, and developed a programme which is supporting over 49,000 young people. It is ensuring that every secondary school within this area is having an enhanced STEM provision, and that the teachers are upskilled to provide the STEM support that the young people need. We also thought about the progression, and we've ensured that there are STEM scholarships that are available for young people, and are providing around 25 of those every year. Another important part for ourselves was about involving our supply chain. We recognised the value of the supply chain being involved in that education provision, looking at them to be role models for young people in the area, maximising the value of having locally sourced supply chains, and how that can access and lead to jobs for local people. And also following on from our commitment of sharing the understanding, is that we've committed to an independent evaluation so that we know what difference this funding is having for local people. That can be shared with local residents, help inform future strategy. And that has found out that it really was a market leader in sharing that social value. And at the end of the presentation, I'll share a link to where you can read further into those evaluations if you wish. And then the second wind farm that I thought it'd be useful to share our learning from is the Beatrice wind farm, which was Scotland's first large-scale offshore wind farm. Now, this is off the Sutherland and Caithness coast. So for those of you, I don't know if you watch the show The American Traitors, but it's very near to where that is filmed. So one of the most beautiful areas of the UK, a beautiful coastline, but it is in an area which is facing declining population. It's got an increasingly aging population, and we are needing to encourage young people to stay within these areas. So what we did with this wind farm is we had a consultation to identify what were the local priorities, and we established local panels of empowered decision makers who would be able to identify where this investment should focus to make the best value for their local area. And what we found from that is the variety of the projects, so over 361 projects were funded, and that they focus on key strategic issues. The photo here is showing an area where we were needing to enhance the connection between, in Scotland, if we don't have strong bridges and ferry services between areas, it can create a very large detour on the mainland. So we've enhanced this area so that there is a regular ferry which allows people to access the jobs that are available in the more central hubs of Scotland. We have focused on how local community can take action to tackle climate change. And again, when we have evaluated this provision, we have found that 91% of the projects there are still operating, still making a difference, and that without this renewable funding, many of these projects and this economic development of these local areas would not have been possible. And so that is really encouraging, and it's really helped other Scottish communities to understand that the difference of hosting offshore wind can have within their community. As we take it, obviously Scotland is well established, as are many of our other marketplaces that SSE operates. What are some of the lessons we would share and ask other countries to consider? One, it is so important for our industry that we do consider a just transition. We do need to learn from past industries and take that learning and ensure that local people feel empowered and they feel value from hosting these renewable assets in their area and in their environment. We need to really build up on having strong principles of respect between communities and the developer, investing heavily in open dialogue, supportive guidance, so that we can build trust within our relationships. We do find that many of the jurisdictions that we operate in have set some principles for developers and communities to operate under. Scotland has provided some, the UK government have some, and there's some recently published ones in the Republic of Ireland that are really progressing the thinking on this. And that is so important so that everybody involved has clarity over what their role and responsibility is. We've also recognised that communities, this is a new opportunity for them, and we have to give them time to maximise the value from these opportunities. So we focus very heavily on giving them the tools, the support, the access to funding for staff and for expertise, so that they can capacity build themselves in the early years of this funding to be left in a stronger place going forward. And we also have found, and this is a learning for ourselves, is that there is particular value where the communities benefit over the lifetime of the asset. That means that they can enhance and have stability of funding that allows them to generate better and longer term impact from those funds. That isn't something we have always done. For example, the Beatrice Fund was originally meant to be about 6 years. It was delivered for over about 8 years. But now for our other wind farms, for example, Dogger Bank, we have actually stretched that funding so that it's delivered over the lifetime of the site. And we also think about the responsibility of our sector. We need to be able to show both communities, our governments, our stakeholders, the difference that our community is making. And that's where we do think focusing on demonstrating the social impact is so important. And then I think some of these links are going to be put into the site, but for those that would like to understand more as to what SSE does, one, and when it was discussed earlier by Mark about transparency, we produce a report which shows where every pound or euro of our funding is allocated. And we think that's really important in terms of transparency. And then also, when I've mentioned a number of our impact and our evaluations, there is a link here that shows a number of evaluation reports. And particularly, I would draw you reference, there's a lovely video from a number of our Scottish communities talking about the difference that our 10 years of delivering our Sustainable Development Fund have had. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, we've evaluated our Dogger Bank Community Fund for our offshore wind farm, and there is a link to that evaluation on the page as well. But thank you all so much, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Thanks so much, Lindsay and Mark, for these great presentations. We do, as we often do, have questions coming into the Q&A, and just remind people to drop your questions into the Q&A so that we can hopefully get to them before we end today. Before we do that, I just want to clarify. I have a couple of clarifying questions for each of you, or one for each of you. Mark, I think before we get to a place where we can establish good practice or best practices, is it important that we arrive at common definitions for some of these terms that we've been discussing? And if you think it is, why is that important?
That's a good question. I gotta say, I believe it is just to have an understanding, because it can clarify what the expectations are for each of the respective parties. That, a host community agreement is something that's different than a community benefit agreement, but a host community agreement can fold in some of the needs of what a community benefit organization or community organizations are going to represent, but it makes it easier for enforceability. I think that while those terms are important, it's also just the process of engaging in that agreement and having an inclusive process, whatever the final name might be, is more important, so that we're able to have that. I think Lindsay did a great job highlighting some of the consultation that goes on, that procedural element of energy justice, to bring that in. So the name is important, but the agreement and the process for how it is developed is more important, to ensure that it is capturing the full slate of interest and managing to maximize the allocation or distribution of benefits to different groups.
And can you just break down a little bit, because I'm not sure I completely understand. I mean, I've heard distributive, restorative, procedural justice, like
Sure.
what the difference is between those things and why they're kind of independently important.
It's independently but connected together. So if you think about the procedure elements of just having access into the process itself, and there are stakeholder engagement plans that offshore wind developing companies will have put in place for how do they do outreach within the community. Excuse me, it could be targeted outreach, it could be holding community meetings, and that's beginning that listening process of what are community concerns. But in helping to shape what their projects will look like, how they might design different options. The distributed element really is about, what benefits are being created by the project, could be created by the project, and how do we allocate them in a fair and equitable manner. So ensuring that parties who have suffered from historic harms are able to then access the benefits. So it is the provision of a direct benefit to, and that the restorative one is trying to deal with some of the intergenerational issues, knowing that these farms come through generations. There has been historic exclusion from opportunity, and to ensure that we are not just addressing what is happening today, but what has happened over a length of period of time. And then the recognition part simply is an acknowledgement of past harms that have happened over a longer period of time. So they kind of have each of their own independent parts, but when they all come together, it is engagement, it is listening, and then it is the creation of benefits and the allocation of those, and the continued engagement and participation of those parties in how they are governing or administering the distribution of those benefits.
Great, thanks. Now, Lindsay, this is kind of a question, a topic that's near and dear to my heart, because we know that a lot of our ocean users are hardworking, our commercial fishermen are spending time out at sea. It's difficult for them to engage, to wrap their minds around the complexity of projects, the timing of projects. It's difficult for people who work and have kids to get to all of these meetings and engage. So I'm really interested to hear, how you know what a community prioritizes.
Yeah.
And how do you focus on delivering quality outcomes when a community might be stretched too thin to really engage back at a level that helps inform those decisions?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. It is, we can see very clearly from the sites and the experience of where there has been very strong consultation, inclusive consultation, how that has accelerated the impact of what communities can achieve with that community investment or the community support. So there are a number of things that we think are very important. One, it is ensuring that consultation, as you see, communities are very overstretched. So it's having a consultation that involves the different partners in it and involves different mediums as to how people can engage. For example, we have just had a large onshore wind farm in Shetland, which is a very remote part of Scotland, up almost closer to Norway, an island area, than to Scotland. And so within that consultation, there was online consultation, there was a consultation document that went to every household within Shetland. There was events that people could participate. There was specialist events for industry, specialist events for young people, to ensure that everybody's views was it was taken account of and was valid. And from that, we were able to identify what the primary priorities of that community were. What we would also say is very important is that this becomes more of a living document, and that it's something that this exercise of consulting and sharing views is something you review. We try and do that. Currently we do it about every 5 years within a community, because we need to have flexibility. The ambitions and the priorities of communities change, and we need to evolve with that. So for example, we often talk about during the pandemic and the instant change that had to happen in communities. So there became a lot more of an interest in terms of how they could enhance their health provision in the local area, how once people were going back into work, how they could have hubs within their local communities that people could work from. We also prioritised investing 10% of our income that we invest in communities. We invested 10% of that within the first 4 weeks of the pandemic happening, so that communities had access to that emerging and emergency funding.
Great, thank you. So there's this other, I guess, some confusion, or people wonder this and ask these questions, and this is for either of you, but like sometimes there's this gap, like we know there's a community benefit agreement, or we know there's a bidding credit to address something that is a community priority, and still there's vocal opposition to a project coming from different pockets of the community. And so I wonder if you can kind of talk about the difference between, or the function of a community benefit agreement, right? That it's not designed as a quid pro quo necessarily, like to buy your silence or to buy to buy approval of a project, or if there have been examples of agreements like that kind of create this mistrust that in a community, that the only reason you're coming to talk to me about this, and this is so that I don't look at your project or I don't give you approval. Like, how do you deal with some of those is there a difference, I guess, in the definitions, in the types of agreements? And then how do you deal with some of those real, I guess, real concerns that people have, which I guess goes back to the trust, like, why should I trust you kind of question.
I can start on that. So I would say that there often is there's an agreement or an arrangement that, particularly for the host community agreements, where the developer is agreeing to pay funds or compensation for specific activities, excuse me, and the government, the local government, which they're signing it, either provision of a right of way, allowing for construction. So there is an exchange between the different parties too. I think when you're dealing with a local government, that's why could be such as an agreement not to oppose permitting. So those are difficult decisions and difficult processes, and there will be parties who will be in support of it, and parties who will be in opposition too. So there is often an exchange of obligations between the parties, and when you're creating that legally binding agreement, that might be different than for a community benefit agreement, where the ones who are seeing they are seeking some sort of resources from the developers themselves, but might not have the legal authority in order to assist them in their development process.
I don't know if you want to add anything, Lindsay.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard because obviously I'm not as aware of the American guidelines and around this. What we do find within the UK and in Ireland is there's probably a little, we try and have flexibility. We do often have legal agreements with communities on these provisions, but we are trying to make it more flexible and having it so that there's not a one size fits all. And we also know that sometimes drives that have been adding to the complexity of the legal structures around these agreements that has been very problematic for communities, and we need to ensure that this has communities at the centre of it and is about enabling them.
Thank you. From an industry perspective, and Mark, you can speak to this too if you've seen it, are the increased costs associated with delivering community benefits reflected in the energy prices, or like reflected in the contract prices?
So,
go
sorry,
ahead,
Mark.
Yeah, Lindsay's got on this one.
So from an industry's perspective, so in the UK and there the value of the community benefit increases with what's called our retail price index, so that makes sure that it's viable. But we have to, it is something that's a key driver within Europe, is about both ensuring the affordability of energy across all, and so it is balancing the value that is provided through the community investments, while with also trying to provide the lowest cost and most affordable energy. Also within Europe, we've had to look at how we increase the energy security, and local energy has been a key focus for us through that.
Yes, and the numbers that I have seen have not would not provide a significant increase to prices. You're seeing the New York example that I did present is not, it's the distribution to residential utility customers is in the couple of dollars a year range. You're seeing total cost of community benefit agreements as compared to total cost of the investment in the facilities, which are hundreds of millions of dollars. Facilities 0.6, 0.8%. I believe the agreement negotiated for the port facility in Salem was going to be about 3% of the total cost of that facility, of the investment into that facility, would be then subsequently used in turn towards a community benefit agreement. So these are again, meaningful, impactful dollars that are being spent, but we have to think about the total size of the projects that are at play here and the investment that those companies are making into it.
Okay, these next, I'm going to ask two questions and kind of couple them together and as kind of a part one and a part two. The part one I think is more open-ended, so both of you can jump in. And then the part two is definitely more specific to you, Lindsay. But how are commitments to measuring social impact reflected in offshore wind contracts? And you can speak to this in the Scotland, UK context, Lindsay. But is this something that, you know, a company elects to do like SSE, or is it something that's required of them? And if it's required across clean energy projects, is the data or the way we measure the value standardized so that you know, there's kind of a common approach to doing that, or should there be a standardization? And I'll ask the second part after, but
Yeah, apologies about that noise there. If you heard that, the UK is about to go through a very large storm, and it's the first ever time. I think you do it a lot in America, but we don't do it over here, where the government can send an alert so that everybody is aware. So I have never had that before.
oh wow!
So apologies. So yeah, I had it once when I was on holiday in Florida, and you sent out an alert, and we were like,
Yes.
oh, very
this
clever.
Is a message from the
yeah,
emergency broadcasting system.
That's the first time I've had it here. So an example of how climate change is impacting within the UK. So in from the jurisdictions that we've operated in, it has not been an enforced requirement to measure that social impact. We do think Japan have really progressed some of the thinking on that, and they had put some guidance in. It wasn't enforced. We are aware that in the UK, our waters are actually owned by what is called the Crown Estate, which is an offshoot of the royal family, but with some of the most of the profits go back into the government. And so for those leasing rounds, the future leasing rounds that are just about to come out, they are putting some requirements in around how do you measure the social impact, and we really welcome that. But most of what we are doing, it is voluntary, but it's about knowing the responsibility. So if you look at other funding sources of a similar size and scale, they would be providing this. So we have a responsibility, we feel, to do that as well. It is also very helpful for us in terms of our environmental social governance requirements as a company to deliver these skills. But I think that there is something that is in the infancy for our industry. And I actually think if we prioritised it and enhanced it, it will enhance the responsibility we have and the view that is held of our industry. I think this is something that we can accelerate our provision on.
I guess the follow-up to that, since we're still, I just want to give you a chance to talk about this, Lindsay, is can you talk a bit about the approach to measuring that you used that resulted in this increased social return that SSE Renewables talks about?
Yeah, absolutely. I noticed in a number of the questions was asking about this, so I'm delighted to speak about it, and I will put in some links after the session. But so in the UK, and it's a European-wide initiative, and it's called Social Return on Investment, and it is a methodology where you can quantify the value that funding provides. This is supported by an organisation called Social Value UK, which are around, have an international provision and agency as well. And we get our Treasury produce a green book of measurements and what their value is to the state. And so it is utilising from that. But what we think is very important is we work really closely with the communities to understand what outcomes they would like to focus on. And then we help them identify measurement tools that can help them capture that and capacity build them so that they can measure their difference. But it is a tool that is recognised, it is used across primarily our voluntary and third sector, which I think is probably a stronger component than maybe it is within the states, and then across our statutory provision, and now is becoming increasingly recognised within our commercial organisations as well. And I can share a link to Social Value UK where you can find a little bit more about that methodology.
Great, thank you. Mark, we have time for one more question before we close, and I just wanted to know if there are examples, we haven't talked about this much, of tribal benefits agreements, other than, or if you looked at that in your studies.
Not beyond what has happened with in Massachusetts with that agreement. So I am not sure if there have been other agreements signed for onshore renewable energy development, particularly where you have the interaction of federal, private, and tribal lands out in the West. So I'm not aware of that, of anything that else I can point to other than what has been completed in Massachusetts.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you again, both of you, so much for joining us today, and thank you to all of our listeners and all of you who support TNC so generously. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with a link to a recording of this webinar. And sadly, for now anyway, this has been the final webinar in our offshore wind series. It's been our pleasure to bring to you all of this incredible information about the different aspects of offshore wind in the United States and around the world, and to create a platform for experts and professionals who share their incredible work with you. We appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment to respond to the poll on your screen before signing off. And if you've enjoyed this series, please be sure to share the recordings with your friends and colleagues. You can find past recordings at nature.org/MA webinars, and you can register for upcoming webinars on different topics there as well. To learn more about offshore wind in the United States, go to nature.org/offshore wind. Connect with the Massachusetts chapter's social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. Thank you again. It has been our pleasure. Have a wonderful afternoon.